The morning after we buried my mother, I stood in the snow outside our bakery in the same black dress I'd worn to the funeral, and I watched a locksmith drill out the lock she'd installed with her own 2 hands. There was a notice taped to the glass door, the kind printed off a home computer, the toner already smearing in the wet air. My stepfather stood inside in the warm yellow light, drinking coffee out of one of Mom's chipped blue mugs, not looking at me. An hour later, a charcoal gray Audi pulled up to the curb, and a woman I'd known my whole life climbed out in a wool coat the color of slate, walked up to that door, read the eviction notice top to bottom, and said one word: void. If you're listening from somewhere cold today, somewhere with snow on the ground or just snow in your heart, do me a favor and tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is. I want to know I wasn't the only one standing out in it. Let me back up because the whole thing only makes sense if you understand what the Bluebird was. My mother opened it the year I was born. She was 30, fresh off a divorce from my father, with a cosmetology license she never used, and $400 she'd hidden in a coffee can. She rented a dead storefront on Main Street in Birchwood, Vermont, scraped the old paint off the windows herself, and started selling cinnamon rolls and bottomless drip coffee to the men coming off the early shift at the lumber mill. That was 31 years ago. By the time I was in high school, the Bluebird wasn't a storefront anymore. It was the town's living room. People got engaged in that corner booth. People came in the morning after funerals. I know that now, in a way I didn't used to, and sat there because the coffee was hot, and somebody knew their name. She didn't do it alone. The other half of it was a woman named Adele. Adele came in the second winter looking for work and never really left. She wasn't family. She wasn't even from Birchwood, but she had a head for numbers that my mother flatly did not, and within a couple of years the two of them had turned the place into a real business. Incorporated it, bought the building when the old landlord wanted out, the whole thing. They were partners. 50-50. I grew up calling her by her first name and thinking of her as the aunt who balanced the checkbook. She taught me to make change before I could ride a bike. She is important. Hold on to her. My father was never in the picture in any way that mattered. He sent a card sometimes. So for a long time, it was just Mom and me and the bakery and Adele, and that was a good life. I want to be honest about that because the bad part comes next, and I don't want you thinking it was all bad. When I was 25, my mother met a man named Roland. He came into the Bluebird in a way that, looking back, was a little too smooth. He owned a couple of self-storage facilities up by the interstate, and he talked like a man who'd read one book about business and decided it made him a king. He was charming, the way a cold front is charming. You don't notice the temperature dropping until you're already shivering. My mother, who had been alone and working 16-hour days for 2 decades, fell for it. I get it, I do. She was tired, and he made her feel taken care of, and after a lifetime of taking care of everyone else. That must have felt like a vacation. He moved in within a year. He brought his daughter, my stepsister, a girl named Kayla, who was 19 at the time and not unkind exactly, just raised by a man who taught her the world was a thing you took from. They got married at the courthouse on a Tuesday. I wasn't invited. My mother told me later, on the phone, in the careful voice she used when she already knew I'd be hurt, that Roland thought a big wedding was a lot of fuss. That was the first degree the temperature dropped. There would be many more. Here's the thing about a man like my stepfather. He doesn't take over a place all at once. He does it the way you'd boil a frog. First, he had opinions about the bakery's hours. Then he had opinions about Adele. Why do you need a partner, Margie, when you've got a husband now? He started calling her the bookkeeper. Like 30 years of co-ownership was a temp job. He pushed my mother to refinance the building and free up some capital for one of his storage schemes, and when she said no, he didn't yell. He just got quiet and cold for a week, until she felt like a bad wife for protecting the one thing she'd built. I watched all of this from a distance, because I'd moved to Boston for work, and every phone call from home had a little more frost on it than the last. Then 2 years ago, my mother got sick. It was her pancreas, which is the kind of diagnosis where the doctor's face tells you the timeline before his mouth does. I came home. I gave up my apartment and my job at a marketing firm, and I came home to Birchwood, and I moved into my childhood bedroom, which my stepfather had already half converted into a home gym. And I started running the bakery so my mother could rest. And that, friend, is when I learned what I was worth in that house. To my stepfather, me coming home wasn't a sacrifice, it was a convenience. Suddenly, there was someone to run the business he wanted to liquidate. Someone to drive Mom to chemo so he didn't have to rearrange his golf. Someone to absorb the household's anxiety so he could float above it. He didn't pay me. When I brought it up once, gently, because I was always gentle with him, I'd been trained to be, he laughed and said, "Your family. Family doesn't bill family," which was a remarkable thing to say to the daughter who was working the bakery for free, while he charged his own stepdaughter's groceries to my mother's credit card. My stepsister Kayla was around more by then, too. She'd moved back after dropping out of a nursing program, and she had a way of treating me like the help. She'd come into the Bluebird with her friends and order off the menu and tell them, loud enough for me to hear, that her stepmom basically owned the place. Which, I would learn, was not even slightly true. But I didn't correct her. I'd gotten very good at not correcting people. I'd convinced myself it was patience. It was actually just fear wearing patience's coat. For 18 months, I poured myself into that family and that bakery and my mother's last good days. And the whole time I told myself the same thing every quiet woman tells herself. If I'm good enough, if I'm useful enough, if I don't make trouble, they'll finally let me belong. My mother died on a Thursday in February. She died in the upstairs bedroom of the house she'd bought before she ever met Roland, with my hand in one of her hands and Adele's hand in the other, and my stepfather downstairs taking a phone call about a storage unit. I'll let you sit with that detail, because I had to. We buried her on a Saturday. The whole town came. The booth got filled. People I'd known my whole life held my face in their cold hands and said she was the best of us, and they were right. And on Sunday morning, less than 36 hours after we put my mother in the ground, my stepfather changed the locks on her bakery. I found out because I went in early, the way I always did, to start the ovens. My key didn't work. I stood there in the gray dark, turning a key that wouldn't turn. And through the glass, I could see a man inside I didn't recognize. A realtor, I'd learn, with a lockbox and a clipboard. And behind him, by the register, my stepfather, drinking coffee out of my mother's blue mug like he owned the place, which he had decided he did. He came to the door, but he didn't open it. He talked to me through the glass like I was a vendor who'd shown up on the wrong day. He told me he was consolidating the estate. He told me there was a cash buyer for the building, a developer who wanted to put in condos, and that escrow was already open. He told me the house was going on the market Tuesday and that I had until then to get my things out of my childhood bedroom. He said all of this in a reasonable, regretful voice, the voice of a man being forced by circumstance to do something distasteful. And the whole time my stepsister sat in the corner booth, my mother's corner booth, scrolling her phone with her boots up on the seat. I want to tell you I fought. I didn't. Not really. I stood out in the snow in my coat, and I said something small like, "Mom would never want this." And he gave me a look of such tidy pity that it nearly broke me, and he said, "Your mom isn't here to want anything anymore, sweetheart. It's time you grew up." And then he turned and walked back to the warm. I did the only thing I could think to do, which was the thing I'd done my whole life when the cold got bad. I called Adele. She didn't gasp. She didn't tell me it would be okay. She asked me 3 questions in a flat, level voice. Has the building actually transferred? Has he shown you any paperwork? Are you somewhere warm? And when I answered no, no, and no, she said, "Stay right where you are. Do not leave." I'm 40 minutes out. And then she hung up because Adele has never in her life wasted a word. So I waited. I sat on the cold metal bench outside the hardware store across the street, where I could see the bakery, and I watched my stepfather's reflection move around behind the glass in the warm light, hanging a sate pending sign in the window of the place my mother bled for, and I shook. And I won't pretend it was only from the cold. When the gray Audi finally pulled up, Adele got out, and she had someone with her, an older man in a long camel coat, carrying a leather portfolio, who moved like he charged by the minute. Adele walked straight past me to the bakery door and read that home-printed eviction notice the whole way down. And she said that one word, void. And I swear the temperature on the whole street changed. My stepfather opened the door then. He had to. You don't ignore Adele when she's standing on your doorstep with a lawyer. He arranged his face into the warm investor smile, the one he used on bankers and widows. Adele, he said, I'm so glad you came by. It's been an emotional weekend for all of us. Come in out of the cold. I am not cold, she said, stepping past him into the bakery without being invited, the way you'd walk into a building you owned. We just keep holding on to this. She did. I followed her in. So did the lawyer. The realtor with the clipboard looked up, confused, sensing the wind had shifted, but not yet knowing how. My stepsister took her boots off the booth. Adele didn't take her coat off. She walked into the center of the Bluebird, past the pastry case my mother and I had filled 1,000 mornings, and she looked around at it. The lockbox, the Sate sign, the developer's clipboard, with the expression of a woman finding mud tracked across a clean floor. Take that sign out of the window, she said. The realtor looked at my stepfather. My stepfather kept his smile bolted on. Adele, I appreciate you being protective of Margie's legacy, I do. But this is a family matter now, and the estate is being settled responsibly. The building's sold. The deal's done. I'm sorry if Maren got you worked up. She's been very emotional. The deal is not done, the lawyer said, and it was the first time he'd spoken. He had a quiet, bored, surgical voice, the voice of a man who had ended more arguments than my stepfather had ever started. It can't be. The seller doesn't own the asset. My stepfather laughed. It came out brittle. Excuse me. This is my late wife's bakery. I'm her surviving spouse. Everything she had passes to me. That's how it works. That, Adele said, is what you've been counting on for 6 years. And it would be true if any of this had ever belonged to her alone. She turned to me and her face changed. Not soft. Adele doesn't do soft, but something close. Honey, sit down before I tell you this part, because you're about to find out you already own the floor he's standing on. He just never read the fine print. I sat down in the booth, my mother's booth. My legs had stopped holding me. The lawyer set his portfolio on the counter, by the register, right on the spot where my mother had taped a photo of me at 6 years old, missing 2 front teeth, and he opened it, and the sound of those clasps snapping was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in that quiet room. The Bluebird, he said, is not a sole proprietorship. It hasn't been since 1996. It's an LLC. 2 members, equal shares. He laid a thick document on the counter. This is the operating agreement, signed by the late Margaret Hale and by my client, Adele. He turned a page, and here is the relevant clause which the 2 of them wrote together a very long time ago, long before you came to town. On the death of either member, that member's interest does not pass to her estate. It does not pass to her spouse. It passes by survivorship, directly, automatically, outside of probate, to the named successor. He looked up. Margaret's named successor is her daughter. The room was very quiet. My stepfather's smile was still there, but it had stopped meaning anything, like a porch light left on after the family's gone. That can't be right, he said. Margie never told me about any. She wasn't required to tell you, Adele said. Vermont isn't a community property state. What she built before you and what she structured to stay outside the marriage was never yours to inherit. It was never yours to sell. You spent the weekend trying to sell a building you don't own a single nail of. The house, then, my stepfather snapped, and his voice had finally lost the smooth. The house is ours. I lived in it. My name's on. Your name is on nothing, the lawyer said, gently, almost kindly, the way you'd correct a child. He pulled another set of papers. The house is held in an irrevocable trust your wife established in 2017, the year before you married. The sole beneficiary is her daughter. You've been a guest in it for 6 years. As of her passing, you're a guest who's overstayed. And then he laid down the last thing, and I watched my stepfather read it, and I watched the exact second the floor opened under him. Now this, the lawyer said, is interesting, because 3 months ago, while your wife was in hospice, someone took out a $140,000 line of credit against the Bluebirds building, forged her signature on the member resolution. Funny thing, you can't borrow against an asset the borrower doesn't control, and the bank's already flagged it. He smiled for the first time, and there was nothing warm in it. Adele caught it in the December reconciliation. We've had the forensic accountant for 2 months. We've had the sheriff's economic crimes unit for 3 weeks. We were going to wait until after the funeral, out of decency. He glanced at the lockbox, the SATE sign, the boots-up booth. You didn't extend us the same. I looked at my stepfather, and I did not see the king anymore. I saw a man who'd spent 6 years lowering the thermostat 1 degree at a time in my mother's house, who'd convinced a dying woman she was lucky to be taken care of, who'd tried to skim 140 grand off the bakery she built with her bare hands, and who had just learned, in front of a realtor and a lawyer, and the stepdaughter he never once paid, that he'd been squatting the entire time. That he blocked me out of a building I owned. That he put my mother's house on the market without owning a single shingle. You sabotaged her, I said. My voice came out raspier than I expected. You pushed her to refinance for years. You wanted the business gone before she died so you could take the cash, because you knew you'd be locked out the second she was gone. He didn't deny it. He just looked at me with the old contempt, the look that used to make me apologize for things that weren't my fault. After everything I did for this family, he said. You didn't do anything for this family, Adele said. You consumed it. Margie spent her last good year managing your moods instead of resting. You want to talk about what you did for us. She let that sit. Maren ran your wife's business for free for 18 months and drove her to every appointment while you took calls about storage units. So let's not pretend, in front of God and a notary, that you were the one holding anyone up. My stepsister in the corner had gone very pale and very quiet. She wasn't scrolling anymore. She was 19 years too late, realizing whose side of the line she'd been standing on. And for the first time, I felt something for her that wasn't anger. She was a kid raised by a man who taught her the world was a thing you take. She didn't know any other way. That mattered to me later. Remember her. The lawyer turned to me, and he did something my stepfather never once did in 6 years. He asked me what I wanted. Ms. Hale, he said, you're the owner of this property and the trustee's beneficiary of the home. The forged credit line will be handled by the bank and the sheriff regardless. But the sale, the lockbox, the listing on the house, that's yours to stop or continue. What would you like to do? I sat in my mother's booth, and I looked out the window at the snow coming down on Main Street, the same snow that had been falling on me an hour ago when I was the one locked out. And I thought about every quiet woman who has ever stood out in the cold, telling herself she just needs to be a little more useful, a little more patient, a little less trouble. Take the sign down, I said. Cancel the sale. Take the house off the market. I looked at the realtor. I'm sorry you got dragged into this. The building was never for sale. There's coffee on the house if you want it before you go." Then I looked at my stepfather, and here is where I want to be careful with you, because I know what the cold makes a person want to do. There was a version of this where I had him dragged out into the snow, the way I'd been left in it. There was a version where I let him feel exactly what I'd felt. I thought about it. I won't lie to you and say I didn't. But I'm not him. That was the whole point, wasn't it? I wasn't ever the cold one. "You need to be out of my mother's house by Friday," I said. "Both of you. You can take your own things, your clothes, your furniture, anything you brought into it. You can't take anything of hers, and you can't take a dime out of this business, and you'll be answering to the sheriff about that loan whether you leave nice or not. But you'll leave with what's yours, and you'll leave with your dignity. Because she would have wanted that, even if you didn't earn it." I looked at him steadily, and I felt the last of my fear of him just go. "I'm not doing this to be cruel. I'm doing it because she's gone and somebody finally has to stop letting you stay warm in a house you froze her out of." He opened his mouth. I watched him reach for the family card, the blood card, all the things he'd frozen out of me my whole life and would now try to use to buy his way back into the warm. I stood up. I walked behind the counter, my counter, and I lifted my mother's chipped blue mug out of his hand and set it gently in the sink, where it belonged. "You can let yourself out," I said. "I've got ovens to start." He left. There wasn't anything else for him to do. He gathered his coat with as much wounded dignity as a cop man can manage, and he walked out into the snow he'd been so happy to leave me in. And the bell over the door rang the way it had rung 10,000 mornings of my mother's life. My stepsister hung back a second. She looked at me, and there were actual tears in her eyes, and she said very quietly, "I didn't know about the loan. I swear to God I didn't know about any of it." And I believed her mostly. I told her she could come get her grandmother's quilt out of the house, the one her dad would have sold, and that if she ever wanted honest work, the bakery was hiring and I paid people. She nodded and she cried and she followed her father out into the cold, and I have not regretted offering her that, not once. Adele came around the counter then. She didn't hug me. Adele isn't a hugger. But she put one hand flat between my shoulder blades, the way my mother used to, and she stood there with me while the realtor quietly packed up his lockbox and let himself out, and the lawyer gathered his portfolio and the bakery went still. "How long did you know?" I asked her. "About the LLC, the trust, all of it." "Since the day she wrote it," Adele said. "She set the whole thing up the year before she married him, the second she realized what he was. She made me promise that if it ever came to it, I'd be the one standing here, because she knew you'd be too kind to fight for yourself." Adele looked around at the dark ovens, the empty case, the photo of me with my missing teeth taped by the register. "She wasn't worried about him taking the building, sweetheart. She was worried about you letting him. So, she made sure you wouldn't have to be brave enough. She made sure you'd just already own it." I cried then. Standing behind the counter of my mother's bakery, in the same black dress I'd buried her in, I finally cried, and Adele kept her hand on my back the whole time and didn't say a word, because she never wastes one. I want to tell you the rest, because the rest is the part I would have wanted to hear. Those 18 months I spent telling myself I just needed to be more useful. We opened the Bluebird the next morning. I started the ovens at 4, the way my mother taught me. And by 6, the booth was full of people who'd been at her funeral 2 days before, and they sat there because the coffee was hot and somebody knew their name. And I refilled their cups and I let them tell me stories about her, until I'd heard things about my own mother I never knew. The forged loan got unwound, the bank ate it, and the sheriff's office is, as I record this, still working on the rest, and I'll leave it there because some things you let the law finish. My stepfather sold one of his storage facilities to pay the lawyers. He doesn't come into town much anymore. My stepsister took the job. She's good at it. She makes change faster than I do now. And last week, a customer told her she basically runs the place, and I watched her not correct them. And I watched her smile, and I thought, there's a kinder way to grow up after all. The house is mine. I sleep in my mother's room now. I kept her recipe box, the metal one with the rust on the lid, and there's a card in there in her handwriting for the cinnamon rolls she sold that first winter to the men off the lumber mill shift. And I make them every Sunday, and I give them away for free. Because $400 in a coffee can built all of this, and the least I can do is start the next 31 years the way she started the first one. I think about that morning a lot. The key that wouldn't turn. The warm yellow light I was locked out of. How close I came to just driving away and letting him have it. Because that's what I'd been trained to do. Leave quiet. Take the cold. Don't make trouble. And I think about how the whole time, in a metal box in a lawyer's office, my mother had already made sure the worm was mine. She just needed me to walk back through the door and claim it. So if you're out there somewhere cold today, locked out of something that should have been yours, told one too many times to just grow up and take it, I need you to hear the thing it took me 31 years and my mother's death to learn. You are not too much trouble. You were never the problem. You're just somebody who hasn't read her own fine print yet, who hasn't found out that the door she's standing outside of has had her name on it the whole time. Start the ovens, take down their sign, pour yourself a cup in the warm. And if any of this landed somewhere real for you, stay a minute, leave a comment, and subscribe, because there are more of us out here than you think, standing in the snow, finding out a little too late and just in time that we own the floor. The key that wouldn't turn taught me something I spent 31 years avoiding. For most of my life, I believed that if I stayed useful enough and quiet enough, the people who froze me out would eventually let me back into the warm. Roland counted on exactly that. Men like him don't lower the temperature all at once. They do it 1 degree at a time until you've talked yourself into thinking the cold is normal. The cold is your fault. The cold is just what family costs. I let it happen because I mistook my silence for patience. It wasn't patience. It was fear wearing nicer clothes. What actually saved me wasn't luck. It was a decision my mother made years before she got sick, back when she first understood what kind of man she'd let into her house. She didn't panic, and she didn't beg him to be better. She sat down with Adele and she built something he couldn't reach, an operating agreement, a trust, a successor line written in plain ink, so that when the worst day came, the worm would already be mine. That is the difference between reacting and thinking. My mother saw 6 years into the future and quietly closed every door he'd try to walk through. Adele held that secret for years, not because it was easy, but because a promise made to a friend is supposed to outlast the friend. That's character. It isn't loud. It just shows up at the curb in a gray Audi 40 minutes after you call. And then there was the part nobody could do for me, the part where I had to stop apologizing and stand up in that booth. I could have driven away. I almost did. The training to leave quiet and take the cold runs deep in people like me. But somewhere between the locksmith's drill and Adele's one word, I found the spine I'd been borrowing from everybody else my whole life. I didn't use it to be cruel. I gave Roland his clothes and his furniture, and I gave Kayla a job and her grandmother's quilt, because being strong and being heartless are not the same thing, and I refused to become the cold I'd survived. So here's what I'd tell you, standing behind my mother's counter in the dress I buried her in. Build the thing he can't reach before you ever think you'll need it. Keep your promises to the people who trusted you, even when it would be easier not to. And when the day comes that you're standing in the snow looking at a door that won't open, find out whether your name was on it the whole time, and then have the nerve to walk back through. I wasn't too much trouble. I was never the problem. I was just somebody who hadn't read her own fine print, and once I did, I started the ovens and never apologized again.